Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Antony Carpen here, and this is what the other side looks like. I'm here in Relevant Records Cafe on Mill Road in Cambridge, and we have just had the most unbelievable clusterfuck up in the world of politics. Because the United Kingdom yesterday, in its infinite wisdom, decided to vote to leave the European Union, which is a historically seismic event. 40 years ago, or just over 40 years ago, the United Kingdom voted to, first of all, go into what was then the European Community, and this was back in 1973, and then after 2 years decided to have a referendum on it and decided to remain by quite a substantial margin. But what happened last night came as a shock to many people, myself included, and interestingly, the pollsters got it wrong, the money markets got it wrong, the pundits got it wrong, everybody got it wrong, apart from the Brexiters. So what's happening at the moment, as you can imagine, is there are a lot of people just picking over the bones. So what was the result in Cambridge? Well, Cambridge, like several other places, went strongly against the grain of national opinion. Rather than voting for an exit from the European Union, nearly 75% of voters in Cambridge voted to remain in the European Union. And I was one of them. As I said in previous videos, my argument simply was that the problems that we are facing in this world today are global, they cross national boundaries, so therefore we need international institutions to deal with them. Yes, the European Union has its problems. It's got even bigger problems today, I can tell you that. And I just couldn't see how stepping away from it was going to change that. Or certainly I couldn't see how it was going to improve things. So the question is, how did we get to there? Aside from the comments that I made yesterday about Cameron's short-term thinking, trying to neutralise the threat of UKIP. The irony being, he tried to spray UKIP with a policy that was, you can have a referendum, and instead of killing off Nigel Farage, it just increased the size of the Nigel monster, and it has resulted in the Prime Minister announcing his resignation first thing this morning, and I watched it live, and yeah, it was coming. And this was despite him saying that irrespective of the result he would stay on and oversee the negotiations, as it turned out, and I think in part because the rejection of his policy, the margin was over 1 million votes. I think that was resounding. Interestingly, Labour don't seem to be helping themselves at all in this front. Dame Margaret Hodge, amongst one or two other backbench MPs, have tabled a motion of no confidence in Mr Corbyn. I can understand why they've done that, because in the grand scheme of things, certainly early on, Labour's campaign was very, very lacklustre. It only really got going in the final, really in the final few weeks. And as a result, and I think in particular in the North East, where many supposedly safe Labour seats returned votes for an exit from the European Union, there are a lot of questions being asked. And very interestingly, when you compare the results for, let's say, Sunderland, fairly safe Labour area, or Hartlepool, to Lewisham, you find a huge disparity where the northern cities ended up voting strongly for exiting, while the inner London constituencies voted by some margin to stay within the European Union. And as it turned out, even the votes of Scotland were not enough to save the United Kingdom. As it turned out, all of the areas in Scotland delivered a very, very strong Remain vote. So at the moment, as things stand, the United Kingdom is going to start the process of exiting the European Union. The checks and balances that are there from the European Union are inevitably going to diminish, and that means the only real check and balance that an otherwise very powerful executive has got is Nicola Sturgeon up in Scotland. And today she has quite understandably said there has been a material change in the conditions that the previous referendum was undertaken under, because the strong case for the Remain in was the guaranteed membership of the European Union. That is now no longer the case. So she has started the processes for preparing for a new independence referendum for Scotland. And, quite understandably, I can see Scotland going in that direction, because why would it want to be tied to an England and also to a Wales, surprisingly, voting exit that, in the grand scheme of things, certainly as far as Labour are concerned, are just going to return continual Conservative or Conservative stroke UKIP, by the looks of things, governments. And this is also where, when we look at domestic policies, this for me has implications for Cambridge, because on Monday, Cambridge City Council votes again on whether to accept the devolution offer negotiated by councillors and by ministers and officials. Now, I've always been against it in principle. My take is that the whole thing is a cop-out from the much-needed reorganisation of local government. The day after that, Cambridgeshire County Council also votes on the new agreement, which, to be fair, is a substantial improvement on the first one. The first one was actually a despicable piece, not worth the paper it was printed on. But given the huge change in the political context and the political climate, given that the Prime Minister has resigned, and given that his Chancellor, who's really been the driving force behind all of this, is going to go with him because Osborne and Cameron are tied at the hip, my take is that the whole process for devolution in Cambridge has to be suspended until we know what sort of Whitehall government, or what sort of central government we're dealing with, and who the new Prime Minister is going to be, because as things stand, the current Prime Minister and the current Chancellor are absolute lame ducks. And we've been through this before. We went through this in 2007 with Tony Blair, the final few months of his time in office. Again, it was just him being a lame duck until he resigned and Gordon Brown came in for his coronation. So where does this leave Cameron in terms of his place in history? Well, I think this is, for me, the irony with Cameron and Osborne. They despised Gordon Brown so much, yet ironically they displayed certainly George Osborne displayed so many of the traits, the negative traits of Gordon Brown. And it's not a result of their strength that we're in the situation that we're in, it's a result of their weakness that we're in. Nigel Farage, the Vote Leave campaign, ran the campaign that they did. Personally, I thought the final poster that Farage unveiled was despicable, it was horrible, it was racist, it was disgusting. But in the grand scheme of things, his agenda worked. And I think, for me, one of the really big learning points from all of this is about the control of the media, and of the print and the mainstream media. Leveson remains unfinished business. For the past 20-30 years, we've had drip headlines from the tabloid press screaming negativity and misreporting what's been happening in the European Union. And there was no way a 6 to 9 week campaign was ever going to overturn 30 years of hate headlines on a daily basis. In the grand scheme of things, I don't really blame the people who voted exit, because if you picture it this way, most people have got very, very busy lives. They don't have time to follow politics. And so, the newspaper that they get, most of them will buy it not for the politics, but for things like the TV, the sport, the celebs, the gossip. But if in their busy lives that is the only outlet they have for the politics that they get, then understandably that's, over time, is going to shape people's views. And so, when I look back on it, does the Brexit vote surprise me? Well, no, it doesn't. So, where do we go from here? Well, it's going to be a few years before the United Kingdom formally leaves the European Union. the legal process could take certainly as much as 2 years, and ministers have already indicated that it won't be till autumn at the earliest that they trigger the Article 50 clause, which formally begins the process of negotiating on how to leave. The other interesting rumour that's gone around is that there could well be a general election in the autumn at the same time, which will make for interesting reading because, amongst other things, the opposition parties are in turmoil. Certainly Labour and the Liberal Democrats still seem to be in turmoil on the back of that vote. Labour obviously going through their own potential leadership challenge, the Lib Dems unfortunately being nowhere to be seen, which I guess in a strange way is, I would say ironic, but I think that's the wrong word for it. Just at a time when perhaps the country and society needed a strong liberal voice as a result of being in coalition and perhaps the mistakes they made in coalition or even going into coalition in the first place. As far as England and Wales was concerned, that voice simply wasn't there, and there was no way a party as small as the Green Party was ever going to be able to make up for that gap. If anything, the writing was on the wall when UKIP pulled 4 million votes in at the general election, or when it pulled in so many members of the European Parliament in the 2014 elections. It will be interesting to see what happens with UKIP. Will they self-implode? Will they demise? Will they disband? Or will they just evolve into a traditional, right-wing nationalist party that perhaps you'd see on the continent of Europe? It remains to be seen. Ditto with the Conservative Party. So yeah, absolutely gutted beyond belief for everyone who voted Remain. We live in interesting times. So yeah. Sorry.